Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very, 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 very special edition of Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. Today, we have a very special event with Sangita Nayak, who is a teacher at Fernwood Montessori School. Before we get started, if you are a teacher in a classroom, we're so glad that you joined in. If you're an individual, a homeschooler, or anybody else who loves kids books, you are welcome too. We want to let you know that you can also host events with Boswell. And so if you're interested in that, in doing events directly, where an author like Veera will actually do a presentation, maybe there'll be a PowerPoint involved. And these are virtual, just like the events that you used to have when authors visited your school and will visit your school again someday. I want you to contact Jenny at boswellbooks.com if you haven't, and talk to her about opportunities. If you're just a few classrooms, you can join in with other schools because we can group them together. So what a delightful thing to do. So today we're being joined by Veera Hiranandani, the author of How to Find What You're Not Looking For, which is a brand new book, and also other books, but most notably The Night Diary, which was a finalist for the Newbery. So we are joined, I'm Daniel Goldin from Boswell, and we are joined by a good friend and wonderful teacher, Sangita Nayak of Fernwood Montessori School. So I'm waving to Sangita and she is waving back. We have a very complicated setup because that's what life is like in COVID. And we're so glad you're working with us. But now I would like to welcome Veera. It is such an honor to have you here. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. Would you tell us where you are?
Yeah, I'm outside of New York City in Westchester, so like suburban New York. And I'm sitting right now in my office that I work in, and it's kind of a converted attic space in my house, all the way on the top of my house. So that's where I'm coming to you from.
Yay! I'm very fond Westchester Memories because my father worked. I grew up in Queens, but my father would cross the first the Whitestone Bridge, and then it was built the Throgs Neck, and he worked in Yonkers and then White Plains, both in Westchester.
So I am close to both.
Ah, very nice. Very conveniently located to a coat factory that hasn't been in business for many decades.
Oh, interesting. Not the Burlington coat factory.
No. They made coats for, and no one will even know what these are. They made coats for Spiegel's, the old catalog, and also actually Lane Bryant. So, and a few other things like that. So, but a fine brand that is still at malls around the country. So we'd like you to start by just saying a few words about your new book. We're going to talk about both books, but we'd love for you to say a few words about how to find what you're not looking for.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So How to Find What You're Not Looking For is about an 11-year-old girl named Ariel who lives in a small town in Connecticut in 1967. And she is Jewish and her family is Jewish, and they run a bakery in town. And when her older sister falls in love with an Indian college student and wants to marry him, Ariel's parents are not in favor of the marriage. And it really changes the dynamics of their family really forever. But Ariel suddenly starts to find herself having to navigate her world in a way that she never had. It sort of connects her to kind of the larger world. She has to really think about what her sister's doing and how she feels about her sister's boyfriend and why her parents think the way they think, and her own Jewish identity. And all of these things come together for her. And she's dealing with some challenges at school. She has a bully saying anti-Semitic things to her. And she also is dealing with what she finds out is a learning difference that she doesn't really understand at first. And she kind of has a teacher help her through that. So There are a lot of things kind of coming together for Ariel. And of course, it's 1967. So there are also a lot of things happening in the country at the time. And Ariel's older sister, Leah, and her fiance at that point, they are inspired directly from the Supreme Court Loving versus Virginia ruling, which happened in 1967, which was a ruling that was brought to the Supreme Court by Richard and Mildred Loving, who were a white man and a Black woman who got married, and their marriage was considered illegal in the state of Virginia. So they fought their case. It was finally, they won their case in 1967, and that case banned any laws in any state that had laws against interracial marriage. And so at that time in 1967, 16 states still had those laws. And so this book is inspired by my own parents' marriage. They got married in 1968, and my mother is Jewish American, and my father is from India and Hindu. And so they got married in 1968. And one thing I always thought about was, what if my parents had wanted to get married in 1967 in a state? They got married in Connecticut, which didn't have laws like that. But what if they got married and wanted to get married in Virginia, where it was illegal for them to get married? What would they have done? Would they have left? Would they have not gotten married? So it really, that question really was the genesis for the book.
Wow, so much to unpack. So yeah. I'm going to pass to Sangita and say, what do you want to start with? So much exciting stuff in this book.
So much stuff, and I have a bit of a technical feedback, so I will make my question really short, Veera. How do you ask your family all these questions and get them to unveil like what happened and maybe a difficult history? And my other question is, how do you keep this voice of a 12-year-old?
How do I say that?
Get the voice of a 12-year-old. How do you as a person who's not 12 anymore,
right,
become a kid?
Become a kid. It's not that hard, I find. The inner 12-year-old inside of me is, I think, really present. I think part of that is because that was a more difficult time for me growing up, and I had to switch schools, and I went to this really small private school, and then I had to go, and it was very like creative and arts-based, and I felt very accepted, and I knew everybody so well. And then I went to the town public school, and it was such a change. And people started to ask me questions about my background, my name, and my identity in ways that I had never had to confront before. And so there weren't many Jewish kids in my town, and there weren't many Indian kids in my town, let alone both. And so it was a really confusing time. And so I've always kind of gone back. That was when I figured out, wow, the world is really complicated. I'm not sure as I, understand it or even like it as much as I did, a year ago when I was in this other school. So it was a time that I really remember very well. And I can kind of tap in those feelings pretty easily. And as far as talking to my family, well, I think they're kind of used to it by now, because the night diary, I was sort of exploring another aspect of my family history, my father's side of the family. And this was actually exploring more of my mother's side of the family, because the character has two Jewish parents. And so I was doing more research in that way and kind of exploring my own Jewish identity. And, as an adult now, I can talk to my parents. I'm lucky to still have them, and they're very supportive of my work. And I can talk to them pretty honestly about what they went through and what they remember during that time. And my mother's parents, my Jewish grandparents, were also not in favor of their marriage at the time. And it was very dramatic. And eventually everybody came around and sort of evolved and figured it out and accepted new ways of thinking. But my parents were kind of really willing to risk that. They were young, they were in love. And so I was kind of just seeing what that felt like for them. And then also creating a story that wasn't exactly their story. I wanted to see something like their story through a younger person's eyes. So that was really the lens I
love the idea of you writing the night diary and then looking at your mom and saying, oh, by the way, you're next.
Pretty much. Pretty much, I'm like, Mom, it's your turn now.
One of the things, I also love the idea of you saying it's so easy to remember being a kid. We had an author this week who said, when you get older, you think all your past is going to be so long ago, but you wake up in the middle of the night and say, I should have, done something, and it's like so vivid still.
I know. Certain parts, middle school and that age is really vivid. There are like years in high school where it feels a little sort of blurrier, like I wasn't as in touch with myself. But then, like in college, there was that year I really remember, and the other year that was like, wait, what happened? So it's funny how you have that selective memory about your youth. Yeah,
definitely.
Usually it's in times where you're maybe struggling a little more, figuring out things a little more, that you remember the most. The kind of smooth, happy times are I think the blurrier times when you think back, which is kind of sad in a way, but yeah.
Fortunately, our memory does block out some bad things,
Yes.
So
yes, that's true.
We thank the memory for that.
Yes.
I'd love to ask you, you do have family history in the books, but you also have things like the Loving case. What other kinds of research did you do for this book in particular? Also Night Diary, where we know you had to do a lot of research, but you probably had to do some research here too. What kind of things did you do, and what kind of things did you discover to create this amazing world?
Sure, thank you. It wasn't quite as research heavy as the Night Diary. I was born in 1971, and so I grew up in a small town in Connecticut. So just a few years later, some of the sort of details about kind of Connecticut and the town and things like that were pretty much the same. But I had to really research, the 1960s and the end of the 1960s, and make sure I knew the timeline of the major events that were happening in this country at that time. So, looking at what, the Loving ruling from till the end of the timeline of the book. So certain things were going on, the Vietnam War. Dr. King was assassinated in the timeline of the book. So I had to keep thinking, well, how would this family interact with that piece of history? So these are all the major events. This was what was on, I was like looking at TV schedules, literally TV schedules of like, would they watch this show on Sunday? There was a timeline thing I remember where I had them, I think it was that the family is celebrating, or just they sort of forget that it's Rosh Hashanah. And then they watch this movie, Hard Day's Night, the Beatles movie on TV. And I had the dates all mixed up at one point. And I had them watching the movie before it was actually aired, but then they were celebrating Rosh Hashanah, and I had to like switch things around because my timeline was incorrect. And I was like, most people probably wouldn't notice that movie wasn't on, but there's going to be that one person that's like, hey, you know what? That movie was on a month before you said it was. So I made sure that was correct. But yeah, researching when the Beatles album came out, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, I want to make sure I was accurate about all those little things that happened.
Well, I was going to say that it wouldn't just be one person. So it would be lots of people. And I always say authors, like if you have a fact that's wrong, people can't sometimes get stuck on that. I've read bad reviews revolving around a silly little fact, and it's almost better to make something up, to say, okay, it's a different movie they watched that didn't exist, than to have the right movie in the wrong place. I love how Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is in the book a few times. First of all, it was the big album of 1967. Two, right. It's actually a pretty kid-friendly album compared to like what the Beatles would have done. There's a lot of songs that, like I played on the piano. And, when I'm 64 and it had a really, I mean, we still listen to it now, but I remember growing up in the 70s, that album was still really huge, and so that was part of why I was excited that I could put it in, because I was thinking of my favorite music kind of in the 70s, and certain things didn't quite line up, but certain things did. So yeah, well, because the Beatles had their big, getting too deep in the weeds here, but they did all their throughout the 70s, they would still release, even though they didn't exist, they had broken up, they would release like the singles compilations and various things like that. And of course, it's also interesting because it's also an Indian hybrid. They got very involved in Indian in music from South Asia during that.
Right.
And
they traveled to India and then kind of took the music and put it in their album. But I don't know how they handled it exactly, how they did that. But yeah, they were definitely influenced by it. So
well, they had some real like, it's always tricky. Was it appropriated or was it just showcasing? But they did use musicians from the country and things. So they were using there was an authenticity to it too. Sangita, what's your next question?
Yeah, okay, all right, so thanks for dealing with my sound. We have 32 friends in here who are listening in too. So
hi.
There is a lot of passion for cooking food, it seems like, in your book. So there was a question around there from one of the students, like, how do you feel about cooking food yourself?
Yes, I love cooking. Is that the whole question? Okay, good. I love cooking, and I love cooking when I have time. I mean, I cook all the time, and I have kids, and I'm constantly just making dinner. But when I do have time and can be a little more creative, I really do enjoy it. And I like baking, but I also love writing about food, and I love reading about food. I read a lot of like food memoirs and things like that. Something about people describing food well is just really enjoyable for me to read. And it always makes me remember, even in fiction, just in novels, whenever a character has a meal and describes the food in whatever very specific way that character eats, whatever their cultural background is or not, or however the food is being communicated is really fascinating to me. So that's something that I've always used. And I think it's also helped me to connect with both sides of my family and sort of the different food cultures in my family. And so that was a place that I just felt really comfortably connected. And so food, I'm sort of showing that in the characters. And also whenever I read a scene, another writer, writes a scene and says the character has lunch and they don't tell me exactly what that character is having for lunch, I feel a little disappointed. I want to know. So I really love that. And so the bakery was really fun to explore. Ariel's parents run a bakery, and there's a lot going on in that bakery. It's hard work, and she sees her parents working really hard, and she helps them, and she has a lot of responsibility in the bakery. But it's a place that she also feels really comfortable, and she can sort of, bake some nice cookies, and she feels really proud about that. And I think cooking is a place a lot of the time where kids can feel really proud about making something. I know when I was a kid and I was able to I learned how to bake a batch of cookies for the first time, that felt really exciting to me. Like, I made these. So I think I was showing that with Ariel. And then of course there are just the other things about that's how they make their living. And so that was kind of part of the plot as well.
But it's definitely true in both books that food brings people together. And it sounds like that's true in your own life as well. I wanted to say, I grew up in New York, a lot of Jewish bakeries. We do not have a Jewish bakery here. You have to go to Chicago, but I love the recipe for black and white cookies. I'm completely obsessed with black and white cookies. I once did a trip to New York, and all of you can plan this someday, where the only sweet thing I had was a black and white cookie. Once at lunch, once at dinner, always from a different place. And I want to say several bakeries here have tried to make black and white cookies, and they're always terrible.
Oh, wow.
Somebody overnighted me Zabar's cookies for my birthday. Not great. However, there is this fabulous little mini black and white cookie you can get at Woodman's. It's got a lot of preservatives in it, but it's so perfect. It's exactly right. It's got the frosting on the bottom the way it should. It's got the white has the little lemon zest in it.
Yes, that's good. You're all the nuances.
Absolutely. So I want to say cheers to that. I just want to give a shout out to a lost New York bakery, mostly Jewish bakery thing called the Charlotte Russe. from my
Oh,
childhood.
yes.
It was sponge cake and whipped cream, and it was like a push pop and a little cherry on top. And you don't see them anymore. But
You don't see them anymore, and my mom loved them. And she grew up in Brooklyn, and she always tells me about those. And as a kid, I didn't have them around as a kid in Connecticut, and I was fascinated by them, and I never had one. But I always thought about, my mom would describe them, and they sounded so good.
Olivia wrote in and say, maybe you could get it in New York, but I have to tell you, I don't see Charlotte Russes around.
I don't see them.
So actually, if you guys want to look at, I might be able to send this when Sangita is asking a question. The Charlotte Russe is actually in Atlas Obscura, talking about the death of the Charlotte Russe. So we had a question. I'm going to go to Sangita in a second, but I want to take some questions. And here's one from Mrs. Nero's class in Wisconsin. They asked a little about where you got your information from, which we answered, but you didn't answer what made you want to start writing? Because we have a lot of kids out there, and I'll bet a lot of them are thinking, maybe I could be a writer. But what started you on this journey?
Yes. Well, I think I just enjoyed making things. I was a creative kid, so I wrote a lot. I did a lot of art projects. In my old school, we would constantly be putting on plays and making pottery and doing all this stuff. So that was really a part of my life from very young. And I was really encouraged in my house to just kind of play and make things and do things. And so I think writing was always a part of my life, and I enjoyed it. I wrote a lot of poetry. I got like a poem published in the paper when I was really young. So I also had positive reinforcement about making art. And so I think that was something that I enjoyed. But then I think when I also switched schools and I didn't have any new friends at the new school, I think I really did turn to writing in a different way, in a more serious way, to kind of write in my journal, in my diary about how I was feeling, or write poems about how I was feeling. And I did use writing in a different way up until that point. And then I also read. I really fell in love with reading at that point, because the characters in the books kept me company during a lonely time. And so that combination of kind of writing to sort of feel more in control of my life and sort of work out whatever I was feeling, and then the reading just came together. Now, I didn't know I'd grow up to be a professional writer, but it was just something I always loved and always did. So it was more in college when I started taking creative writing courses, and I thought, well, what does that mean to be a writer? Can I do this? And so, eventually, many, many years later, I am.
Wow, and we're all better for it. But I love the advice you give is so important, to read a lot and to write a lot. So,
and to do it in a way that you find places that you loved, to read. I'm very, pro whatever book you want to read it, kind of, your choice. Maybe you can't do that always for school and assigned reading, but I read tons of comic books. I mean, I just read everything that I really loved, and was able to write things that I didn't think about. Is this good? It was just an expression. And I allowed myself to do that for many, many years before I even tried to kind of write well in that sense. So I was allowed to play and do it for fun.
Cool. Sangita, what's your next question?
Sure. So I would love to ask about the typewriter in the new book, because we have a typewriter in our classroom.
Oh, you do?
Randomly. So what was your love of typewriters, or how did you get that in that story?
Yeah, well, part of it is Ariel finds a real freedom because she has difficulty handwriting. She has something called dysgraphia, which makes handwriting difficult for her. And often kids with dysgraphia find it easier to use keyboard. And so my son has dysgraphia, and he's a great typist, and he's really fast on the keyboard, and that's really helped him. And then I myself, handwriting was never my favorite thing. So I don't know if something was not diagnosed. I'm not a very good speller, but I feel much more comfortable typing. And I remember when I learned how to type on an electric typewriter in high school, and I got really good at it. And it did sort of kind of unlock me. I used a word processor really early, and then just started composing all my writing on a keyboard. And so that's part of Ari's journey of just kind of thinking about, the right tools, and that sort of looking at kids individually, what is sort of going to work for this kid in this way. And it helps her express herself in poetry. And she always thought she was a bad writer. And then she's able to, with the right tools, express herself in a different way. So I really feel close to that kind of journey for a kid.
Well, that sort of ties together in Night Diary too, because both Nisha and Emil have, certainly Emil has learning differences as well.
Yes.
So I love talk a little, I think you've said it, but in Emil's case, he has more of a trouble reading.
Right. So, I mean, I don't label it, he has dyslexia, which is different than dysgraphia. So it's more, he has a little more trouble reading and decoding in that way. But he's a really good artist, which is interesting, and that can happen with kids with dyslexia, where they can draw, but the reading is harder. But it's 1947 in the Night Diary, and so in their context, they wouldn't necessarily know, and maybe a lot of times Papa just feels frustrated with Amal, like, why aren't you kind of trying harder? You've got to focus more, things like that. And often kids with learning differences do get that feedback even now, and feel sort of misunderstood that way. And then Nisha in the Night Diary is also, dealing with a social anxiety issue. And that is also not labeled, because maybe it wouldn't be labeled then. But yeah, so I tell a lot of my characters kind of have some kind of learning difference that they have to navigate.
Well, we love that, because you make them the heroes of the story. And so there's all different kinds of heroes. So
absolutely.
They're terrific.
Absolutely.
We have a lot of questions from A Nani Mouse. And one of them was, how long does it take you to write the books?
Many, many years. So the Night Diary took me about 5 years from the beginning to holding it in my hand as a published book, many revisions. This book took about 3 years. And it got a little slowed down during the pandemic, and there were some delays because of that. So it took a little longer in that way. But it takes me about a year to write a draft. And then I, showed it to my editor, and along the way, my other writing friends, and I get a lot of feedback, and I do multiple revisions. So usually, the following year is just doing revision after revision, maybe even a third year. And then it goes into kind of the publishing machine, which can take another year for the book to come out. And so it's something that I would do anyway. Publishing is not a fast business. And so you have to really love the ride, and you have to really love writing, because you just simply love writing, because it can take a long time.
Wow. Talking a little more about writing, Mrs. Nero and I think another teacher asked if you would share any techniques as a writer that a kid can follow. I think and Sangita saying yes, excellent question.
Yes. Well, I think, I find that I get easily overwhelmed. I can be a little anxious about things. And so for me, it's simplifying things, almost tricking myself that something's easier and simpler than it is. So for writing, I feel like I work better trying to write most days. I don't write every day, because it's impossible sometimes, but to write for short amounts. You always have 15 minutes that you can find to just write a little bit. And sometimes I just write for 15 minutes if, I have a really busy day, and other days I can write for a few hours. I can't really write for more than a few hours. I can't sit at my laptop and write for 8 hours. So even if I had the time, it's hard for me to do that. So I do it in little bits. So if you like to write, a few sentences a day will add up to a story after a while. And so that's one tip, to just get words on the page and see what you have after. And then to free yourself to know you can always change it. I revise a million times, so I know it's just kind of the first try. It's not trying to get it perfect while I'm just writing and just being creative.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a good idea to not self-edit yourself when you're writing. Save that for later.
Yeah, unless you do it naturally, but if it blocks you, just free yourself to write whatever, and then you'll read it later. You fix it later.
We have a lot
Can
of questions. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I can jump in and ask. There's been many note cards that get passed to me about 75 questions right now, but I will not.
Oh, ask.
Oh my gosh.
But I had some students who read Night Diary and are pretty excited about what inspired you to write it. Kind of how many drafts or what process was it like to write it? And then are you going to do a sequel? So that was some of the questions.
Yes.
You read it.
Yes, well, it was really just, doing the research and then writing and figuring out the structure and the diary format. And then often I would get to some kind of block where I needed to do more research. But I like to sort of combine the writing and research process together rather than doing so much research in the beginning, because there are things I just discover on the way of like, oh, I have to now go and research that more. And so it helps me from, first of all, going down a research rabbit hole where I won't write. And so I kind of do it in tandem. And so that's that process. There was like a second part of your question that I'm forgetting now.
I think they wanted a sequel too.
Oh, the sequel, of course. So I am writing the sequel now. I'm full in working on it, in a draft of the sequel. Because it's publishing, it may not come out for another 2 years, but I'm on it. So I'm excited to revisit the characters.
Well, you made a bunch of people happy just now.
There's some woohoo. All right, collective woohoo for the sequel.
Hey.
We have a lot of people asking about inspiration, and I think you've given some of the inspiration that these come from your a little bit from your parents' stories and a little bit made up. But what was the first like germ? Like where you're like, this is what was it a moment? Was it a character? And also, do you have an aunt who would be Ariel?
Do I have an aunt who would be Ariel? That's interesting. So yeah, things don't quite line up that way because actually my mom is an older sister. There is this picture of my mom as a little girl. This picture was definitely formed the family for me. My mom's a little girl and she kind of has short curly hair. And then she has her older sister who's, about 5 years older, not quite the age difference, but she looks very glamorous in her stylish dress. And then my grandparents, and the four of them. Now, actually, but then I'm also inspired by my parents' marriage, but my mom's the younger sister. So it's somehow that I thought of this family from that photograph, except that my mom is the younger sister and my mom's older sister, my aunt, married somebody Jewish and didn't have that same, thing happen. So it's kind of like there isn't this one-to-one correlation. There's a lot of influences in every character. But that picture was really the vision I had for the family in a way.
Well, it's a lot of what people say about you took some things that were true and you turned them into fiction. And when somebody said, "Who are you in the book? Are you Gita?" And you're like, "I'm everybody. I'm nobody and I'm everybody."
Right, exactly. So, same with every book. Even my most autobiographical book, The Whole Story of Half a Girl, which was my first book, was based on a lot of my experiences growing up, but it was based on that. There are certain things in the book that did not happen to me at all. And so it's all just a bit of a mystery.
Miss Archambault's class would like to know what the main message you want folks to take away from after reading this particular book.
I don't know if there's one message, and I don't really write to sort of share a specific message, but I do hope that people just think about, how are they sort of on the inside of things and part of the majority, and how are they on the outside of things and maybe part of the minority and the places that they feel not accepted, and the ways they can, or if they notice that other people might be feeling that way, and how do you sort of accept people's differences and just try to see who they are. At the same time, respect those differences. You don't want to necessarily wipe them away because they're important to the people who are holding them and experiencing them. So I think that if that's one main theme of thinking about those things, because Ariel, you know, she understands that she is part of a marginalized community. She is Jewish, but at the same time, it's the same as for Leah's boyfriend, Raj, who comes here and he's been in the country for a few years and he has brown skin and an accent and he's treated differently. So there are all these different areas where you might have kind of be marginalized or have some privilege. So that's what Ari is figuring out for herself.
Sangita, do you have more questions from the class or from yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's National Writing Day, so we're excited about writing lots of questions, apparently. I guess there's an interesting question. You've written a lot of books. So which one is your favorite book to write?
I get that question a lot and I can't choose. They all have a different special meaning for me. So like my first book was my first book. That was special. I have a chapter book series. I had never done that before. The Night Diary won a Newbery Honor Award. That was an incredible experience. It was also probably the hardest book that I've written so far. And then this book was just, you know, discovering sort of and doing more research and on my Jewish side of my family was just really important to me personally. And then of course there were just lots of cookies. So that was really fun too. They all have that very specific personal meaning. So I can't choose.
Somebody wanted to, I think this is Ms. Nero's class again, wanted to ask you about the title and how you came up with the title. For how to find what you're not looking for.
Yeah, so I use the second person point of view in the book, which is different than the first person, you know, I do this, I do that, and it's different than the third person, she does this, he does this. So it's you do this, you do this. You wake up in the morning and you look outside and you see it's a wonderful day. And so it's this interesting way of kind of the you is the I, but it sort of makes the you also you as the reader. So you become the main character in a different way that maybe people are used to reading. It's not used that often. And it almost gives this kind of instructional tone, like this is how you live this life, even though Ariel can't really instruct anybody of how to live her own life. She's also experiencing it as she goes. So that's part of what the how-to chapter titles and the title is kind of nodding to, that point of view. So, and also it took me a really long time to come up with the title, but I figured that out. And other books in second person for adults are often called like how to do something. So I kind of took from that and then I figured out what I wanted to say. And I thought it would be a fun title for people to have to think about for a second. How do you find what you're not looking for? What does that mean? So
we're all going to work on that.
Yeah.
Ellie, who is 9, asked, what's the hardest part about being the author? And then also, what's the best part? But I think we can guess the best part. What's the hardest part?
The hardest part is to sort of keep going all the time. I mean, it does take a lot of discipline to keep going back to your writing. And, you know, there's all the fun stuff of getting to do events like this and talking to readers and signing books, and that can be really exciting. But ultimately, the reason I'm doing this is, you know, I want to just get back on the computer and create another story. But I also know it's going to take me a couple of years, and it's like looking at a big hill that I'm going to have to climb again because I love to, but I don't always feel inspired. And so that's why I just try to schedule it and write for an hour or two a day. And often when I start writing, it's kind of like when you start exercising or something, you're like, I don't want to do this. But then when you do it, you kind of get into it. And then you're like, oh yeah, this is why this makes me feel really good. And I love this. Because I feel most myself when I'm kind of in the creative zone writing, but I don't always want to do what I have to do to get there. So that can be hard.
We have Olivia's written a few times, or someone in Olivia's family, that she wants to write, but she doesn't have any ideas. So do you have any easy ways to come up with ideas and stories?
I do. Well, I teach writing a lot. And so one thing that gets people really writing is a prompt. And you can look online and just, look up like fiction writing prompts. And often if you're given a line, a line like, I woke up this morning and I knew nothing would ever be the same again, or something like that, where it just launches you into you as the writer trying to figure out what this prompt even means and sort of going from there. Sometimes that can help. And if you allow yourself like 5 minutes to just write about that prompt, no matter what, and then see what happens, you might get an idea in that.
Sangita, did you have another question?
I did. Comes again from the students, but what is your favorite book, or what are your favorite authors?
Yes. I have so many favorite books. Right now, I'm actually using Hello Universe by Erin and Trada Kelly in my own class. I'm teaching adults how to write middle grade fiction. And so we're really looking at that book closely. I really love that book. And I just read Prairie Lotus by Linda Sue Park, which I also really loved. I'm going to be talking about it on a podcast soon. So those are some books, more modern books that I've been reading. And then, I have so many favorite books growing up, but I'll leave it there. I'll leave it at that.
Do you have a book that, so you talked about, I love that you talked about a few contemporary books, both we love, both of which we happen to love as well. Do you have a book that inspired you to write, or a few books that inspired you to write when you were younger?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I fell in love with reading, the writers that were really available to me were Roald Dahl and Beverly Cleary and E.B. White and Judy Blume. So like Charlotte's Web was one of my favorite books, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was one of my favorite books. And also the Sydney Taylor All of a Kind Family series was really important to me. I love those books very much. And, I didn't read a lot of books that I reflected my background and identity. And I didn't find, I've read very few books about Jewish characters or Indian characters or the combination. And so those books were the only books I knew that had Jewish characters in them. And that, at least I could identify with that part, even though they lived a different sort of Jewish life than I did. But I was fascinated by it. And I love those books.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends growing up who love them as well.
Yeah.
Sangita, do you have a last question? We're almost at the end. I can't believe it.
No, I was just going to say, I love Prairie Lotus, love this book. And yes, no, I think just a super thank you for all of your work. As a South Asian identified teacher, I don't think I read anything that was even close to my multi-identities when I was young. So appreciate your work and the students. And so I think that's it.
That's great. And fun fact, I am actually a certified Montessori teacher. I am.
Oh my God, it all comes home.
Now you have to come visit.
Sangita, you once told me that Milwaukee had the largest public Montessori system. Is that still true?
I don't know about numbers, but I know we're still the oldest Montessori public system. And yeah, we're in a fully public school right now here at Fernwood Montessori, and with 32 children who've been enjoying this.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Yeah, I got certified right before I published my first book, and I was looking for different career paths. And then I started publishing, and then I sort of stopped and then ended up teaching creative writing, but I did that. So yeah.
Your just in case job, so we know that well. So
no, I don't want to say it that way. Because,
well, you never know. Maybe one day you will teach a class.
Exactly. I love teaching, so it informs
You're teaching. Teaching is teaching. So we're thrilled for it. We love that you teach. We love that you write. We're thrilled that you probably edited some great books and we didn't even get to talk about them. So thankful to you for joining us, and so grateful to Sangita, Nayak and Fernwood Montessori and the folks at the Wauwatosa schools and all of you who joined in. We wouldn't have a virtual book series without you, and wouldn't have a bookstore without you. So thank you very much, and hope to see you in another event. And I sent you a link for the new book. You can purchase it at Boswell. We also have Night Diaries, and we also have your first book. So
well, thank you to Daniel and Sangita for hosting me. And it was really great to be here.